Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Library of Virginia. And I'm very excited to welcome you to today's book talk by Frances M. Clarke and Rebecca Jo Plant. Their book, Of Age, Boy Soldiers and Military Power in the Civil War Era, is the first comprehensive study of how Americans responded to the unauthorized enlistment of minors in the Civil War and the implications that followed. The book recently received the 2024 Gilda Lehrman Lincoln Prize, which is awarded annually for the finest scholarly work in English on the American Civil War, the American Civil War era, or Abraham Lincoln. Congrats. The book is available for purchase in the Virginia shop after the program. Now I would like to introduce today's speakers. Frances M. Clarke is an associate professor of history at the University of Sydney. She is the author of War Stories, Suffering and Sacrifice in the Civil War North. Rebecca Jo Plant is a professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. She is the author of Mom, The Transformation of Motherhood in Modern America. She is also the current editor of the journal and database Women in Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000. Please join me in welcoming them to the Library of Virginia.
Thank you so much for coming today, and especially thanks to Anne McCreary, there she is, and everyone else at the Library of Virginia for making this event possible. We worked for like a decade on this book, and still now talking about its contents with someone besides each other feels really special and kind of amazing, to be honest. So far, the talks we've given have really focused on the Union side of the story. So we're excited to be sharing some of our findings about the Confederacy with you today. So over the years, I've learned that if you say that you are writing a book about boy soldiers and the Civil War, many people will immediately think of the VMI cadets who fought at the Battle of New Market. So I thought I would start there. Wow, seamless technology. I thought I'd start there. So just to jump right in, on May 15th of 1864, a Confederate force commanded by General Major John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, sought to repel Union troops near Staunton, Virginia. Am I saying that right? I've read this. How do you say this? Wait, I'm getting different. In any case, I've read this many times and have never really known how to pronounce it. So facing a break in the lines, Breckinridge is alleged to have reluctantly commanded, put the boys in, and may God forgive me the order. This is oft repeated. So the written request looks considerably less romantic. But Union troops were then met by what historian James McPherson, eminent scholar of the Civil War, describes as a spirited charge of 247 VMI cadets aged 15 to 17 who were ever after immortalized in Southern legend. Dramatized in books and movies, the cadets' much retold story has contributed to the widely shared perception that the Confederacy, far more than the Union, was willing to rely on underage soldiers. But, how true is this story? And this is a cartoon. We actually include this in our book, Robbing the Cradle and the Grave, which appeared in a Northern news magazine, Harper's, in '64, and just goes to show, at the end of the war, there's a lot of critiques about how the South is robbing cradle and grave. So, so which side, Union or Confederate, was more willing to enlist underage soldiers and hold them to service? Most people who know anything about the Civil War would immediately say the Confederacy, right? And there's really good reasons to think this. First, one of the most fundamental facts about this conflict is one that that the Confederacy was at a severe disadvantage in terms of manpower. In 1860, the states that would form the Union had roughly 2.5 times the population as those that would form the Confederacy. And of course, the population advantage is even more profound when you consider the enslaved population as well. So, and just to be clear, Confederate elites are really aware of this imbalance and had been expressing a kind of what we call in our book, demographic anxiety for decades prior to the Civil War. As the Northern population boomed, they're very aware that they are shrinking in terms of size, which means shrinking in terms of political influence, right? So as a result, the Confederacy, as a result of these manpower shortages, the Confederacy resorted to sweeping conscription measures just a year into the war, whereas the Union implemented only a lottery-based draft in early 1863. Second, the Confederacy in February 64, it does lower the age of conscription to 17, something the Union never does, provided but the 17-year-olds, are supposed to serve in state-controlled reserve units, not the Confederate Army. And third, the Confederacy never officially banned underage youth from enlisting in the Army, provided they had parental consent, a step that the Union took in early 62, aside for musicians. So the bottom line here is just a cursory glance at the situation. Both the demographics and government policies would lead one to conclude the Confederacy relied on underage use more willingly and completely than did the Union. And indeed, Confederate youths are everywhere in the records, including, as it turns out, in my own family. I knew vaguely that I had relatives who fought for the Confederacy, but as someone who grew up in Kansas, a state that, as we learned in elementary school, fought long and hard for its free state status, I never really felt compelled to dig into their stories. But as it turns out, my own great-great-grandfather, Stephen Madison Plant, enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1864 at the age of 17, as you can see at the bottom of his obituary there, and according to both the census records and the tombstone. So, and here you can see this number here, as those of you who have dug into things, personal property as opposed to property and land, is evidence of slave owning. Never a happy find for a white American doing genealogical research. So despite the seemingly endless cases like this one, the Confederacy's desperate manpower shortages and its lax or sometimes non-existent age restrictions, our research has led us to question this notion of enlistment from cradle to grave. So we found, and this goes for both sides. we're not talking much about the Union today, but basically we found that 10% of the Union Army enlisted below the age of 18. This is one of our fundamental findings. We can't make such an estimate for the Confederacy because of the state of the Confederate records. Some brilliant demographer is going to do this someday, but we don't have those skills. And second, we found that underage enlistment was conceptualized as a problem to a greater extent in the Union than in the Confederacy. Somewhat surprisingly, after February 1862, Congress and the Lincoln administration took steps to ensure that once mustered into service, underage boys would be held to service. And that's a policy that outraged many parents. So just again, to put it simply, in terms of policy, lawmaking, court cases, perhaps even public opinion, underage enlistment, it's a bigger deal in the Union than it is in the Confederacy, kind of counterintuitively, right? You wouldn't think that. So much of the reason for this is simply that the Confederacy had more serious issues to contend with. Desperate wives tended to be more focused on seeking the release of breadwinning husbands rather than underage sons. But that's not the whole story. Compared to the Union, the Confederacy was also more anxious about the dangers of youth enlistment, not to the individuals involved, not to the boys involved, but to society as a whole. And this is what we mean by demographic anxiety. It's that demographic anxiety doesn't just lead to draconian enlistment policies, fears that we don't have enough people in the ranks. It also made Confederate leaders especially reluctant to send the young into the fray, lest they burn through their reserves, so to speak. This deep concern about husbanding human resources was there from the very outset. And unsurprisingly, such anxieties tended to be expressed most insistently by elites like Robert E. Lee, who urged his namesake, Rob, to stay in college rather than join the Army. So before turning things over to Francis, let me just quickly return to the VMI cadets. After the war, those devoted to the lost cause burnished the story of these youths into legend. But in doing so, they skirted the inconvenient fact that the VMI cadets' ages, they actually range from 15 to 25. Of the 10 who died, 6 were actually 18 or older, meaning that they were of conscription age. So most of those youths had been sent to VMI by parents who hoped to prevent or delay their enlistment into the Confederate Army. And this was a strategy not lost on the cadets themselves. So Jacqueline, that was his actual name, Jacqueline B. Stannard, who was 19 when killed at Newmarket, had earlier written to his sister from the school saying, "Do you not candidly think I ought to be in the Army? I am over 18. I think I have been obedient in remaining here as long as I have." And to his mother, he wrote imploringly, "Remember, I will be 19 on the 27th of this month. I ought to be ashamed of myself to be here. You should be more firm and patriotic and want me in the Army, but this is an unnatural feeling for an affectionate mother like yourself." So further muddying the waters of this story is the fact that the Union side also counted boy soldiers among its ranks, the boys that fighting in this battle, including former inmates of the Massachusetts Reform School who had been released on the condition, they'd been released early on the condition that they enlist. And this happened in several instances in the North, even leading to congressional investigations in Rhode Island. So the mythology surrounding the Battle of Newmarket has kind of obscured two unsavory truths. The first is that the Union Army enlisted boy soldiers who had been subject to coercive enlistment practices. And the second is that many elite and middle-class Confederate families tried to prevent or delay their sons' enlistment in the Army by enrolling them in schools and academies. These kind of inconvenient facts call into question the narrative that portrays the Confederacy as distinctive from the U.S. in that it enlisted from cradle to grave. In fact, and I'm not saying that there were less underage soldiers in the Confederacy, we just don't know. But what is surprising about the situation in the Confederacy is not that large numbers of underage soldiers were enlisted, but the comparative ease with which parents were able to recover them and the government's staunch refusal to lower the enlistment age for regular service.
Oh, I think it's fascinating that I did not even know that detail about Rebecca's grandparent until a few days ago. We find that many underage soldiers that, even acts like they're in I don't have any in my family. I don't think. Okay, so, as Rebecca's made clear, the Union and the Confederacy both see really high rates of youth enlistment. And there are a lot of reasons for this. We can talk about this in the question time. The reasons come down to the way people are thinking of boyhood, the way they're thinking about age in this period, the way they're thinking about military service. But for now, I'll just note that there's no moral opposition to youth enlistment in this era. You probably already have that in mind. No one is arguing it's terrible to enlist a child under a certain age. It's morally wrong to do that. You probably know that the US Army is enlisting boys from above the age of 12 as musicians. The Navy's relying very heavily on boys as powder monkeys, as cabin boys. You know, they're typically entered the Navy at the age of 12 or 13. And of course, there's this long militia tradition in the US. After the revolution, you're supposed to be 18 to join the local militia, but actually a lot of boys earlier than that, you know, they're joining up they're going to muster days with their fathers or their brothers. And also lots of younger boys are joining voluntary militia units in the 19th century. So, you know, people aren't opposed at a moral level to youth enlistment. Sorry, Mike, I thought Mike was raising his hands. He's picking his glasses. They're not morally opposed on the basis of children's rights, but they're very much opposed to youth enlistment on the basis of parental rights. Under common law, parents had property rights in children's wages and labour until they reached the age of majority. So that's 21 for males. And that is unless you remain a dependent until you reach that legal age, unless you were quote unquote emancipated from parental control. Right? That's the word they use. And emancipation could happen if you got married or if you set up an independent household and your parents sort of recognised that fact. In both the North and the South, judges before the Civil War really keenly aware of parental rights. And when boys enlisted under the age of majority in the US regulars, without their parents' permission, judges regularly let them out, right? They released them on writs of habeas corpus. So in 1861, when the war breaks out, judges, have sort of very strongly supported parental rights, and very few Americans are worried about the general impact of violence on the young. Although they're actually worried a lot about the physical capacity of boys to serve, which is something else we could talk about in question time, the way people understood the sort of physical capacities of young men and the psychology, you know, why they're not worried about the effects of violence on the young. Nonetheless, there are some major differences between the two sides. So as you might imagine, in a context, right, where a slave society is going to war against a free labour society, some of these differences come out in the memoirs that boys wrote about their underage enlistment. There's quite a number of these, many dozens of them actually. And they're similar in a lot of ways. So you can really see in these memoirs the immense war fever at the start of the war, the peer pressure on boys to enlist. And you can see the way not primary schools, high schools, common schools, you know, colleges, they're sort of feeders into the military. As one Confederate later recalled, every university, college and common school in the South became a site for converting pupils into soldiers. This was in some cases quite literal in the extreme. So in July 61, for instance, the Confederate Congress authorized the enlistment of the entire student body of North Carolina Military Institute. This is a state-sponsored school. It's an unusual move, and it came a few months after the governor had granted the school's president permission to form his own regiment. This became the first North Carolina Volunteers. As a result, the school is temporarily closed. But they basically just get the entire student body and they become a regiment. Little James Dinkin, he still cries himself to sleep at night because he misses his mum so much. We know this from his letters. He's a student at the time. He knew his parents would never consent to his enlistment, but you know, the older cadets are sort of egging him on, and he finally says, I finally determined to risk all by allowing one of them to forge a telegram from my father. And soon after, James and the other students who are at this school are in the state capital here, putting grown men through their paces. He's a drill master. So there's this incredible war fever at the start of the year and this immense pressure on young boys. And schools are effective feeders, partly because they're highlighting, if you don't go, that you've been left behind. We had a lot of expressions like this one from 17-year-old Nimrod Hamner. He'd served a brief stint in the Confederate Army. He's a student at the University of Virginia, and he goes back there after he's released on a medical discharge, and he writes to his mother and he says, "True, I'm not 18. True, I'm not perfectly healthy, but I can't study. All my acquaintances, in brackets, who are alive, are in the army." I don't think his mum would have been terribly persuaded by that, all of the people who are still alive. In any case, both in the Union and Confederate Army, they're facing these kinds of pressures, but the memoirs do show some interesting differences. And one of those is in the authors, like the people who are leaving the memoirs. Those who enlisted underage, the dozens of memoirs we have of those people, they're all describing leaving lives of work, right? They've been working on riverboats, they've been newspaper boys, they've been farmers, they've been printers and shoemakers. And then they talk about their working lives and then enlisting. The opposite is true for the Confederates who leave memoirs. They've all been from wealthy slave-owning families. They've all been in school before they enlist. This is a big difference. And I think this fact suggests the lower literacy rates in the South, suggests the greater barriers to mobility there. You know, when Southerners started working early, generally they're lacking the sort of schooling that someone in the US would than their US counterparts. And it's perhaps also the case that the sort of devotion to the Confederacy that would lead you to pen a memoir later in life, despite being on the losing side, was perhaps more limited to the elite than Confederate leaders wanted to believe. The other big difference in the memoirs is the way both boys on both sides are thinking about their enlistment. Patriarchalism in a slave-holding regions of the country, the rule of the father, existed in a more undiluted form in the South due to the presence of slavery. In the South, boys are sort of more firmly under the control of their fathers, just as wives in the South tended to be more firmly under control of their husbands. And this explains why the Confederate government is so reluctant to undercut parents' claims to their children. As Rebecca noted, the US War Department makes it incredibly difficult to get out boys who enlisted without their parents' consent. They even passed this law early in the war, in February 1862, that said, we're not accepting any more petitions for underage boys. If they have said that they're 18 on their enlistment records, they've become 18 under law, right? They pass a law that says you can't be underage, basically, if you've enlisted. This is how desperate the Union is to hold on to the underage. The War Department in the Confederacy, by contrast, there's nothing similar, no similar law. Right up until the end of the Civil War, parents could still retrieve their children who've enlisted without consent, as Rebecca's going to detail in a minute. The narratives of Confederate memorialists who run off to join the war effort testify to this sort of stronger patriarchalism in Southern households. Authors talked a lot about the trepidation they felt in defying their parents, especially their fathers. So this was the case for James Dinkins here of Canton, Mississippi. He's a 16-year-old in the North Carolina Military Institute when the war breaks out, and he follows his classmates into service. He knows full well that his parents aren't going to approve. After 6 months, he finally writes home, and he's just been through a battle in which many of his comrades have been killed. His very wealthy father, who finally now knows where he is, goes straight away to his camp to visit him, and he brings an enslaved, what they called a body servant, quote unquote body servant, to care for his son. In his memoir, James recalls feeling overcome with gratitude and relief. He says, quote, "Not a word was said about running away and no regrets were expressed." The tone here is really strikingly different from the memoirs that are penned by people who'd enlisted in the Union Army as boys. That James' father bought this older enslaved man to serve him, maybe represented an attempt to restore his son's elite status since he's enlisted as a private. It also, I think, is evidence that Mr. Dinkin probably doubted his son's ability to care for himself amidst the hardships of military service. By 1850 in the US, as many of you will know, there's this widespread celebration of enterprising independent boys. Has anyone read those Horatio Elgar, rags to riches? You pull yourself up by the bootstraps. They're all starting out really poor and then they end up, making good. Well, there's nothing, in the Confederate youth are less able to sort of reap the cultural, psychological support from this imagery. The memoirists basically depict their decision to defy their parents and enlist not as an act of plucky self-making, which is what you get in the Union memoirs. They instead, most of them describe feeling unmoored by their defiance and kind of relieved and empowered once they get consent retrospectively. And here I'll just note that in relation to this image, and this one in fact, that while many Confederate officers brought enslaved males to war to serve as body servants, it's clear that this practice had particular meaning for the parents of white youths who feared that their sons were too young to adequately care for themselves. Actually, this is, in this slide, Kevin Levin has written, did anyone know the work of Kevin Levin? Yeah, he's written extensively about this image of Andrew and Silas Chandler. And he's focused particularly on Silas. He has written a book that's basically debunking the myth of the Black Confederate. But it's also worth noting that Andrew had only recently turned 17 when he enlisted. In some of these cases involving enslaved people accompanying underage white boys, the enslaved boys are themselves underage. And that's not the case here, but it is the case here. Other way around, I think. So we can talk a bit more about the impressment of Black males on both sides in question time, if that's a subject that interests you, but I'll hand back over to Rebecca now.
Okay, so at the war's outset, many people called for a mass, oh, wait, is this my section? Yes, so we're, forgive us here. They called for sort of a mass uprising. They wanted men, women, and children to join together. One young lady of Virginia penned an evangelical tract insisting that God counts none over military age, none unfit for service, who are willing to enlist, praising the fair-haired boy who left his mother's arms to rush to the battlefield. She told readers, the military age is from cradle to grave. But of course, Jefferson Davis, as I've already intimated, and many other Confederate leaders disagreed. Davis discouraged the enlistment of underage youths, especially students. He argued that it was neither judicious nor wise for the Confederate Army to take men outside the range of 18 to 35. This is at the beginning of the war, right? So youths and older men, he believed, were the proper reserve for home defenses, ready to be called out in case of emergency, to be kept in the field only while that emergency exists. So to express his disapproval of youth enlistment, Davis used an analogy that was particularly fitting for this highly agricultural society. He talked about grinding the seed corn. Maybe you've heard this before. It's a metaphor that we don't find in Union sources, even though we looked for it, and even though the Union at this time is itself still largely an agricultural society. So to enlist the youngest and most promising male youths was to undermine the future of the Confederacy before the new nation was even fully launched. References to the dangers of grinding the seed corn were widely reiterated in newspapers, to the point that parents who wrote to governors or Confederate officers in hopes of having their sons discharged often evoked it, or even included newspaper articles where Jefferson Davis is quoted as talking about grinding the seed corn. So despite the pronouncements against underage enlistment, Confederate officers appear to have been even more lax than their Union counterparts in enforcing age restrictions. Companies regularly accepted use below 18, perhaps weighing size and strength above age. And in contrast to the Union records, most of the 15, 16, 17-year-olds, their military records say they're 18. A lot of the Confederate records, if they do have an age, they just record what the age really was. So once their sons had enlisted, parents in the Confederacy, they could have, if they wanted to get them out, they could first go to military commanders, which was often successful, a face-to-face exchange. They could write to the War Department. They often wrote to their governors. And this is another difference with the Union. The story is very much about centralization of power, and the Union governors are all saying you've got to write to the War Department. It's different in the Confederacy. So in the war's first 2 years, the Confederate Secretary of War often granted discharges of boys on requests of parents, even in cases where this would seem somewhat unlikely. So take the case of Edward Strother. He enlisted this is two underage brothers who enlist together. He's 14, his older brother is 17. A few months into the war, the older brother writes home and he says, look, my younger brother's getting really sick. You've got to get him discharged. But it's the mother, not the father, who sends the petition the official petition seeking release. In response, the captain, the Confederacy, like the Union, they would go to the military commanders and say, what's going on here? They'd ask for a report. The captain basically says, Edward's a remarkably strong and able-bodied man who wants to remain in service. And moreover, he points out, hey, this guy's father, he visited the camp, he hung out with us, he consented to the son's enlistment. But nonetheless, in this case, the mother's request was successful. The Secretary of War was willing to overrule one of his own officers, and more remarkably, perhaps even the boy's father, pronouncing him entirely too young to be kept in the Army without his mother's consent, saying he must be discharged. And around this same time, the U.S. War Department had begun to deny nearly all such requests for discharge on the basis of minority. So as the war ground on and manpower needs grew more desperate, some critics began to question the Confederacy's commitment to keeping boys below 18 out of the war. The Confederate War Department tightened up on releasing boys whose parents had consented to their enlistments initially. And this gets us to one of our most interesting sources. We were like, whoa. So this is a letter from a Georgia minister who admitted that misguided patriotism had initially induced him to allow his 17-year-old to join the Army, and he goes to the War Department, he faces a brick wall, and then he appeals directly to the Vice President, Alexander Stephens. And the interesting thing about this exchange is actually Stephens' response. He confirmed that the military would indeed only discharge youths who had volunteered in defiance of their parents' or guardians' will. But he explained his vehement disagreement with this policy. He explained that he'd done his utmost to convince the Secretary of War to adopt a policy of releasing all youths below 18 at their parents' or their own request, but his arguments had been rejected. And remarkably, he then advises the father, just lie, perjure yourself, go to a justice of the peace and falsely swear that you had not, in fact, granted your consent. This is how strongly he objected to the Confederacy's policy in relation to youth enlistment. So, you know, Stephens was a fierce critic of the Confederacy's policies, but here his beliefs lined up with those of Jefferson Davis. So just to switch to the situation in the courts, if petitions to the War Department failed, parents also had the option of turning to the courts. And we talk about this in our larger study. We trace the process of legalization that occurs in the Union as the U.S. federal government denied state and local courts jurisdiction over habeas petitions. After Lincoln's sweeping suspension in September of 1863, it becomes more or less impossible to get boys out of the service in this way. And that shift doesn't really happen in the Confederacy, not least because the Confederate Congress often rejected the president's, Jefferson Davis's, request to authorize the suspension of habeas corpus in the latter part of the war. It's suspended and then it's not. It goes back and forth. But at some of the most critical points late in the war, he does not have that authority. So by the end of 63, it had become clear the Confederacy was in big trouble. Under the guidance of Lieutenant General William J. Hardee, 29 high-ranking officers of the Army of Tennessee took the unprecedented step of publicly requesting changes to Confederate conscription policies. So they're asking that all able-bodied men 18 to 50 be put into service. They want to force bond and free African Americans into non-combat positions, and they want to enroll boys 15 to 18 and men 50 to 60 for potential service at the discretion of the president. Now, all the signatories on this petition, they agree that there's a dire need for men, but 8 officers disclaimed the proposal to enroll boys and older men for service, believing they'd be of more service to the country at home. And so if you look at this petition, what's happening is these officers, they're alarmed enough about the situation to make a direct appeal to Congress, but they all actually declined to support immediate use of boys under 18 for field service, leaving their deployment at the president's discretion. And a significant minority felt so strongly about the issue that they oppose even enrolling use, so they might be summoned in case of emergency. So witnessing the Confederacy's desperate plight, editors, politicians, and military leaders weighed the pros and cons of slave enlistment throughout 1864. They are discussing whether or not, seeing the Union's enlistment, that the United States colored troops, whether or not they could use their own enslaved population. In March of 65, this is 1 month before the end of the war, right? Congress finally passed legislation to enlist enslaved men, though it stopped short of including emancipation as a reward for service. In the end, the Confederacy's leaders chose a policy destined to destroy the slave system they had gone to war to defend, but they actually declined to force white youth into the ranks.
Hey, so much of what we know about underage enlistment in the Confederacy, I think, comes from the late 19th century. At this time, pro-Confederate propagandists start to celebrate the boy soldier as to embrace this cradle to grave imagery. And, what they're trying to communicate here is that the entire South has, risen up, undivided, willing to sacrifice everything, even their young. And this is very much not how Confederate propagandists pictured their war effort while it was ongoing. At the time, there's lots of cheering for, militant white boys in the South. You see plenty of that, but no one is picturing white boys as the embodiment of the Union war effort, like you will see in the US. We've got a chapter in our book that's really showing how Unionists not only accepted, but really enthusiastically celebrated young soldiers extolling these, especially drummer boys, as symbols of Republican virtue. And here they're drawing on traditions that were established during the French Revolution. So outside the Confederacy, artists, writers, painters especially, people writing songs, stories, poems, they're really idealizing white drummers as heroic patriots who, the story is always they're inspiring older men with their while they're retaining their innocence amidst the slaughter and inspiring older men with their sort of the intensity of their patriotism. They're referred to by terms like the spirit of the North or young America. Here's some very common paintings. This was one of the Civil War's most well-known paintings, the Eastman Johnson Wounded Drummer, Spirit of the North again. So we did a lot of digging in Confederate records. In fact, while we were at what used to be called the VHS, we looked through full runs of things like the Southern Illustrated News, Magnolia Weekly, the Richmond Dispatch. We went through full runs of much of we could, and we looked at all of the much of the sort of popular culture stuff that the Confederacy produced, but we didn't find anything similar to this. And I don't think this is not because of the comparative lack of Confederate material. It's not because they had fewer musicians. It's really because images of innocent drummer boys are not appealing as symbols for the kind of nation that the Confederacy is hoping to build. Lots of people have written about Confederate nationalism, and they all agree that, it's very, it's emphasizing tradition, bloodline, sort of vertical order. It's, it's putting forward a vision of family life where slaves, wives, children are existing in an organic hierarchy that's overseen by a benevolent patriot, a benevolent patriarch. So, this is a fairly conservative, anti-democratic vision. Celebrating the agency of the young, it doesn't fit this agenda. And I don't think the symbolism around childhood fits it either. When we think of children, we think of the promise, we think of newness, the potential for change, the promise for the new. None of that is particularly appealing to Confederate propagandists. And in fact, we found that since the 18th century, nations that are based on Republican or democratic systems are really mobilizing or claiming political legitimacy through the use of heroic children who are sacrificing for the larger good. It's very common imagery in Latin American republics, very common in France, very common in the US. Where you don't see it is in monarchical or autocratic polities like Britain or the US, right? Not until the late 19th century. A lot changes in those decades, not just in the US, but elsewhere. Suddenly, all across the country, people start running these, journals, magazines, newspapers are running these competitions to find the youngest veteran. The Richmond Dispatch offers an incredible jeweled medal to the person who enlisted the youngest, and they have these full-page spreads on, they start raising statues to boy soldiers across the South. You get books like this, Susan Hull's Celebration of Boy Soldiers in the Confederacy, published in 1904. Some of this is happening in the Union too, but in the Confederacy, it's just more tied to lost cause ideology. I think, it's really another way of softening the Confederate war effort. Much as they're romanticizing slavery at this time, they're romanticizing boy soldiers as really eager partisans, regardless of age. Conveying, I think, a sense of Confederates as misunderstood innocence, picturing legions of boy soldiers. It's another way of stressing the South's population disadvantage, mobilizing that cradle to grave. Even though we did that, we couldn't compete against such a vast, remorseless enemy. Those who were memorializing Confederate boy soldiers at this time usually engaged in a fair bit of exaggeration. This book here, Susan Hull, I love this. She claimed to feature youths who, quote, pled and suffered that the South might be triumphant, some mere babies who left their cradles to shoulder muskets. No, they didn't. But, most of the boys in this book are actually over the age of 20 and actually find many boy soldiers. But anyway, and then there's this veritable cult. This is the point I want to end in. There's this veritable cult emerging around Tennessee and Sam Davis, which is focusing on his supposed youth. He's those of you some might know this story. He's an accused spy, and he went to the gallows without naming names. He allegedly said, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than betray a friend or be false to duty." And, around the turn of the century, when Susan Hull is publishing that book, the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, is putting up a monument to him as the boy hero of the Confederacy in Pulaski, Tennessee. This is where he'd been executed. 3 years later, another bronze statue of Davis is unveiled on the State House grounds in Nashville. Both are portraying him as a boy in his mid-teens. Actually, the Pulaski version in particular depicts a boy with really soft sort of facial features, offset by the determined stance. But the real Sam Davis was 18 when he enlisted and 21 when he was put to death. One of the disturbing things I think about this topic is how eagerly Civil War historians repeat these stories, especially about the young, without inquiring very closely into their actual age or where the stories come from or what the boys were doing in the war. Many of them were not regular soldiers. They're actually in Home Guard units or whatever. So I want to end there so we have some time for questions. Thank you so much.
We went to grad school together, and with Carolyn Eastman back there, and we formed a writing group. And
well, the story is actually about how we came up with the topic is that I was working in the National Archives. I was I've been a Civil War scholar since university. Rebecca, on the other hand, worked on 20th century history of war psychology and family history, gender relations. So Rebecca's happily working in San Diego, and on my way from Sydney, I would always stop up at her place before I headed to DC. And I was working on a project that was letters written to the Adjutant General during the Civil War. The Adjutant General, all the letters about ordinary people relating to the Union came through this one department. And I was reading those letters, and it's a massive collection. I decided that I would get all the stuff about children and put it to one side because everyone knew they were there, no story there. So I did that for some years, working on this project about citizenship and these documents. But the letters were very interesting to me about the way parents talked about their children. So I took a bunch of them to Rebecca and I said, look at these sources. Parents are talking in this really unusual a way that I didn't think they would. I mean, they're talking about property rights in children, not the sort of sentimental romantic language I was anticipating. So I showed them to Rebecca and she said, that's what you should be working on. And I said, fine, I'll do it if you'll work with me.
Although there have been some attempts to suggest that young children in cases of separation and divorce should stay with the mother, that has begun already by the Civil War, this idea that ultimately would evolve into like the best interests of the child doctrine, that's there. But in the South, especially, for older kids, fathers are legally, it's uncontested, their rights. I mean, there's the law and then there's the law, right? And so a lot of legal historians have basically shown how what plays out in local courts and local communities is actually quite different than what you read in, a law treatise. So there is more, and the other thing I guess I would say about that is that mothers may not have legal rights, but in the letters both to the Confederacy and the federal government in the US, they sure think they have rights. They think they have the best human rights. They use very strong language, including rights-based language, to their children. So, whether or not that's backed by law kind of in their mind doesn't matter.
Just one thing on that mother's petition, it's always hard to tell. We don't know what the relationship was between that parent and that military commander, and that may have been a personal favor. I mean, it's much harder to make definitive arguments for the Confederacy just because of the nature of the sources. That letter collection I was looking at for the Union, where everybody's writing in, everyone who wrote into their governor, their Secretary of War, Abraham Lincoln, they all went to the same place. They're all sitting nicely in boxes. Well, I've been through the entire Secretary of War thing for the Confederacy, but it's so much more piecemeal. It's just a lot harder to figure out what's going on.
Yes, that happened a lot. Men joined in order to protect their sons, and it happened in the Confederacy and the Union. And I think one of the arguments we make in the book, we could make this even more explicit because we didn't look at the older men, but the numbers, like the average age that you get based on Union records, it's all messed up because not only were the young boys lying, but sometimes the older guys, they're lopping off decades. I mean, they're really lying. And so the stats are really, people rely on them too much. They place too much faith in them. But the larger thematic point is that, we have kind of reconceptualized our vision of what a camp looked like. It's not just like a band of brothers. It's more like an all-male family, where you've got, the young and sometimes the quite old, who are taking care of domestic tasks together, helping one another, functioning in ways that, the social bonds, it's not just a group of young men.
Oh, we didn't look very much into the prisoner of war scenario, but there is a really interesting, do you know the Early Indicators Project, which is a massive database started in the 1980s by economic historian Richard Fogel, which collects all kinds of material. It's only on the Union side, isn't it? But so it's hard to know post-war, how people have fared. But that shows that, and it's actually a study, I think, of POWs. It shows that boys who enlisted under the age of 18 were exponentially more likely to suffer from all sorts of long-term physical and psychological ailments, and they were also more likely to be impoverished. So, well, actually, what we found was if the war didn't destroy you, it empowered you if you were underage. So a lot of there's boy soldiers are far more overrepresented in positions of power after the war than their numbers would suggest. They're going into politics and they're very highly in demand as speakers or whatever. But a lot of them fared very badly. And I would say the prisoner of war, from what we can find from the Union records, is that it had devastating consequences for later life. But I don't know that I can be any more specific than that with. Do you sort of mean how were they treated? Were they treated better in prisoner of war camps because of their age? Yeah, people don't talk a lot about age and the effects of that. But now what we know about the development of the brain, it just, it makes a lot of sense that if your brain is still developing, and we now know that the brain continues to develop until the age of 25, there are a lot of implications about, thinking about what does it matter that people enlisted, under certain ages. Just on the point of them being kind of shepherded by older troops, there is a lot of that going on. There's also a lot of abuse of younger boys. The behaviour ranges a spectrum. A lot of them are seen as sort of mascots or whatever of their regiments, but others are, we're working on sexual abuse at the moment. There's a lot of bad behaviour. Is, of course, Red Badge of Courage, which, that's what most people think of. Well, he wasn't even in the Civil War. But we think of it as a, boys to men kind of narrative. That's the narrative people have told before I talk about underage enlistment. I mean, what do you say about it? They, have some things about how it wasn't good that they usually sent the little kids off to pick up the limbs that were being sawn off. They're sending the children off to pick up the dead. Their lives in war are not pleasant, right? And once you're in, the point to note is you can't get out. Once you've enlisted, you're just in there. It doesn't matter whether you are traumatized and you want to go home and you're only 12. You're just in there, especially in the North. So, yeah, I think it's not a good experience for many. But I think the boys to men, like that narrative, it's appealing. It's been very appealing to historians, I think.
No, I've read that Carolyn Cox book about, I mean, I actually agree that there's probably quite a lot of parallels in terms of, we do have cases with the Civil War testimony of people who it's clear that they're bitter. They're bitter that they feel like the boys who stayed home, this is especially true in the Union, the boys who stayed home took advantage of opportunities. They were able to, all the best jobs, the easiest jobs were taken by them. And now I'm back home, I'm disabled, and I can't find a good position for myself. I mean, I think there's, those stories they're everywhere in the Union pension records for sure. So. Carolyn. Well, the benefits are vast, including traveling to Australia. In my case, I mean, I moved my family, including my school-age child, to Australia for a while. We had a grant, and that's where we actually started the book. We could not have started the book without being in the same place. We did a lot of it on Zoom. We used Dropbox. We used, relied on technology to make the process smooth at later points. But for us in the beginning to really hammer out, like, what are we doing here? Like, one of us had to be like pacing around trying to articulate something while the other tried to type. Like, that's what it looked like at the beginning. And yeah, I think both of us feel like this book has the best of our skill sets and talents as historians. Like, I could not have done this book. I would never have attempted it. I wouldn't have attempted such a big book. Yeah, I think that, like, what it's plus, right? It ended up being, at times it was hard. You of course push against slightly different visions. I'm like, oh, you want a book that big? Okay, like that kind of thing. And but yeah, it worked actually, remarkably.
And then there was just the conundrum. Why won't they just let the boys out of the military? And, what we came to is there's too many of them. They can't let them out. It's 10% of their forces. They couldn't have won the war without this. We're not as interested in the younger boys. It's the 16 and 17-year-olds are the ones they really want to retain. But it was a historical conundrum that drew us in. And for me, it was very much about, I'm very interested in the question of military power in America, why, I guess, how the Civil War led to a kind of transformation of the US military. And so the book is full of those stories. It's really, a lot of it is about the militia versus the regulars, but we didn't deal with that story today. But we better stop there because we've run out of time. Thank you all so much for your questions.